Well, welcome. Thanks everyone for coming out for our first event of the year. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Center for Emerging Democracies at UMich Democracy. Really delighted have such a great turnout for our opening session, and really glad that one of our two incoming postdocs, Leydy Diossa-Jimenez, is going to give our opening talk. Now, Leydy has been here as a postdoc at University of Michigan in the sociology department a year ago, and is joining the center as a Emerging Democracies postdoctoral fellow this year, so for the next 2 years. And she finished her Ph.D. at UCLA in sociology in 2024, and really does amazing work on kind of the intersections, interactions between violence and gender and migration and mobility, and just really marvelous work. So I'm really glad you're all going to get to see her up close, personal for the first event of the year. Leydy has I think she has 60 slides, so I'm a little I don't want to take too long to be brief to make sure she has enough time to actually show us all these slides. Thanks for coming out, and round of applause for Leydy.
Thank you. I promise it will be interesting. I hope so. You can tell me if not later on. Okay. So I'm going to read so I can convey the message straight and the argument, and also to leave a little bit of time for the Q&A. Thank you, Dan, and the Center for Emerging Democracies for the invitation. I'm honored to kick off the 2025-2026 academic year. Thank you, William, Brian, and Rosa Rasmi, and Michael for working behind the scenes to ensure everything runs smoothly. It is a privilege to share my work with you, both as a fellow here for the next 2 years and as a scholar who's deeply invested in understanding how democracy emerges, survives, and sometimes, hopefully, returns. Today, I will discuss my research on violence, exile, and the politics of immigrant rights with a focus on Argentina and Colombia. Between 1970 and 1991, I examined the process of granting immigrant political rights in these two countries as an excuse to dive into the different forms, to rephrase Dan's invitation from the newsletters last week. Autocracies erode and democracies deepen. This presentation is part of my work on the effects of political violence on exile and democracies in the region. I think about these two cases in comparative perspective vis-a-vis Mexico and the Latin American region more broadly. Before, I would like to provide you with a brief overview on the region and explain why Argentina and Colombia are puzzling empirical and analytical cases of interest for all of us. What are immigrant political rights? Let's begin with a note on terminology. I define immigrant political rights as a set of rights that entail, first, the recognition of dual citizenship or the capacity to acquire nationality in other parts of the world, while maintaining that of the place of origin. For example, since 1996, Mexican citizens residing outside the country no longer lose their Mexican citizenship if they become naturalized in another country. This is pretty important for, the United States particularly. Second, voting from abroad, that is the capacity to cast a vote in national elections, even when one is residing abroad through the Constitutional Assembly or the consulate or the embassy, I should say. For example, Argentines abroad vote in consulates and embassies, and since 2019, they can also cast a vote anywhere by mail. And finally, the right of political representation in the national legislative branch through a member of the House and or the Senate. For example, Peruvian citizens living outside the national territory currently have 6 representatives in Congress devoted to the representation of immigrants living abroad. Now that we have defined the immigrant political rights, and what they are, let's look at the approval of these rights in the region. The table shows 19 countries in Latin America. As you can see, there are 3 different types of countries. First, on the top of the table, we have those who have approved 1 or less rights. I call this usually countries who are restrictive. Second, in the middle, you will find moderate countries who have approved at least 2 types of rights. And finally, at the bottom of the table, you can see the expensive countries that granted all of the 3 rights for citizens abroad. Let me highlight a striking trend in this table. In 1990, not long ago, believe me, no Latin American country allowed its citizens abroad to vote in national elections, except for Brazil, which of course approved voting rights in 1965, right before the emergence of the Brazilian military dictatorship or the bureaucratic authoritarian regime, just to use O'Donnell's term, which meant that voting from abroad was not substantively implemented until the return of the democracy around the same time in the 1990s. Fast forward 20 years, 15 out of the 19 countries have adopted those immigrant political rights. And here is the surprising part. The first two countries to do it were Argentina and Colombia in the very same year, 1991. What is interesting when we study Colombia, because Colombia is very difficult to sell as an authoritarian regime. Hopefully I make a good case. In comparative perspective, is not only the scope of rights, which is expensive, but also the timing of approval, which is very early. A similar case will be Argentina, that like Colombia, also approved expensive set of political rights at the beginning of the 1990s. Other well-known cases, such as those in Central American countries and Mexico, took longer to approve this type of rights. I will be happy to discuss the implications of my research on these cases in the Q&A. So the convergence is puzzling because these countries couldn't have been more different. Argentina, as we all know, emerging from its more brutal military dictatorship with six coups since the 1950s, a big economic crisis, and a long history of destination of European migrants. Colombia, one of the region's most enduring electoral democracy, no major debt or inflation crisis in the 80s, and little history of immigration reception. Different histories, different economies, different patterns. Different migration patterns. So why did they both converge on granting political rights and citizens at the same time? In this talk, I am to show you how the work of exile contributes to the approval of immigrant political rights in the homeland, and more broadly, how it shapes the long-term sustainability of democratic renewal in the region during the 1990s. This isn't just an academic question, as you are all aware nowadays. We're living through an era of democratic backsliding, authoritarian resurgence, where exile is, once again, a global political reality, from Venezuela to Myanmar to Russia. Yet, exile is not only a symptom of authoritarianism. Under certain conditions, it can actually become a driver of democratic renewal. My work demonstrates how the type of violence that produces exile influences whether exile becomes politically influential or remain politically invisible in the homeland. Additionally, the Argentine and Colombian cases are helpful, because they address two research and analytical puzzles. After all, we're in academia. So first, there is the issue of timing of rights approval. Why are Argentina and Colombia the first countries in the region to approve immigrant political rights? And here we want to understand why these reforms happened when they did. Second, there's an issue of scope of rights that were granted. Why did Argentina and Colombia approve all these rights, all of these three rights? Bear with me on this one. This is very convoluted. I was trying to summarize like 40 years of literature. The literature offers three main explanations for immigrant political rights. First, economic incentives. Scholars emphasize the remittance dependence hypothesis, arguing that states enfranchise immigrants to keep those funds flowing, money coming in. The limitation here is that it assumes uniform economic motives and overlooks political and social factors. The second, political mobilization. This work highlights how immigrant groups and political parties push for rights as part of electoral and organizational competition. But it struggles to explain where rights are not extended despite strong diaspora activism, or where rights emerge without significant mobilization. Third, norm diffusion, the most recent form of explanation. Here, the focus is on international norms, with states adopting immigrant rights to signal economic credentials. The weakness is that this perspective cannot account for early adopters like Argentina and Colombia, where internal dynamics, especially political violence, were decisive. So while these explanations capture part of the story, they fall short in explaining why Colombia and Argentina were the pioneers. I approach the puzzle differently. I start with the idea of politicide, which is state-sponsored killing aimed at eliminating political opposition. I distinguish between widespread politicide, which targets a broad array of actors, and targeted politicides, which focuses narrowly on specific opponents. When I talk about politicide, I mean state-sponsored violence, as I already said, that seeks to wipe out political dissent. But it is important to distinguish two forms of politicide. So in the case of targeted politicide, governments go after specific leaders, activists, and organizations. This produces politically cohesive diasporas with very cohesive ideas and ideas about democracy and the homeland and so on and so forth, with strong shared identities, but their visibility also makes it harder to mobilize openly abroad. By contrast, widespread politicide indiscriminately affects large segments of the population. This creates diasporas that are broader and more diverse, but also more fragmented. The range of voices is wider. This distinction matters because whether exiled communities become cohesive blocks or fragmented networks depends in large part on the kind of violence that drove them out. The type of politicide that has direct consequences of immigrant rights and mobilization. When violence is targeted, transnational ties tend to be weaker, immigrants exert less influence in the home politics, while widespread politicide generates a more politically active diaspora, one that can play a significant role in democratization, and in the case of Argentina, became a leading actor on human rights around the world. We can see this in my two cases. In Argentina, widespread politicide during the dictatorship produced a politicized diaspora that became deeply involved in democratic transitions. They played a crucial role in many other aspects, not just political rights. In Colombia, targeted politicide instead fragmented and depoliticized the diaspora, leaving it with minimal impact on political reforms at home. The contrast highlights how different forms of state violence shape not only exile experiences, but also the broader trajectories of democracy. And I think many of you are here because of this particular interest that we all share on democracies and authoritarianism. The dual transition to democracy model that I developed here. This table, and I want you to follow me closely on this table as I will develop it through the presentation, represents my framework of dual transitions, which considers how democratization unfolds along two axes: political inclusion and political violence. When inclusion is high, but violence remains high, we get what is called violent democratization. Here, institutions open up, but conflict persists, often shaping the way citizens and immigrants engage in politics. That's the trajectory, as we will see, of Colombia. When inclusion is high and violence declines, we see democratic pacification. This is the idealized path where transitions bring both broader participation and reduction in conflicts. By contrast, when inclusion is low and violence remains high, the outcome is authoritarian repression. Regimes maintain exclusion and rely on violence to sustain their rule. This is where we stay in authoritarian regimes. And finally, inclusion is low, but violence decreases. We have authoritarian participation. Leaders reduce repression but without expanding participation, limiting the depth of democratic change. Now, placing my two cases, authoritarian pacification, leaders reduce violence but limit inclusion. Argentina, this is the path of Argentina post-dictatorship, violent democratization, where inclusion expands but violence persists. That is the case of Colombia, 1991. In short, the type of politicide and the trajectory of the dual transitions help explain how immigrant communities form, mobilize, and shape democratization back at home. So this diagram lays out the causal logic behind my argument. We start with political violence, which generates two paths. On one side, violence shapes the formation of exile. I'm just reading, broadly, which shapes, and hopefully I'll give you substantive, information to make to substantivize this analytical argument, which shapes their capacity to mobilize abroad, which determines whether they can influence the approval of immigrant rights. On the other side, political violence triggers a regime crisis and shapes the broader context of democratic transition. And democratic transitions, the idealized scenario is that reducing violence while expanding political inclusion produces a durable democracy in practice. However, the process is far, far, far more complex, as we all know. My approach is to examine how political violence shapes this regime crisis, how this crisis shapes the terms of democratization, especially in terms of inclusion and pacification, and then ultimately how it determines the extent to which immigrant political rights are granted. These are the mechanisms that I want to trace in my research. So briefly about research, I know many of you are interested in getting to know and I'll be more than happy to meet with, because I know there are many students here who would be interested in learning a little bit of this. I would have benefited tremendously. So of course, I'm open and you can reach out. My research focuses on political processes that led exile and forced migration from Argentina and Colombia. I examined the period between 1990 and 1991, which captures consolidation of political violence, transition to democracy, and approval of rights. I use historical and comparative case study approach, selecting Argentina and Colombia as the most dissimilar cases, as I said at the beginning, from 19 countries around the region to highlight the contrast on how exile shaped democratization. My analysis draws on extensive fieldwork, archival research, 18 months of fieldwork, 6 in Argentina. I moved into Colombia, Argentina, and 2 additional months that I did remotely due to the pandemic. And I have to say that I'm very thankful because the pandemic gave me access to people who didn't want to be localized geographically. So it was central. So it was a blessing in disguise. And I also did field work in Mexico for a project that I'm working with separately with another scholar. I work with both National Archives, personal archives. You're going to see a couple of things that come from national and also personal archives, the Constituent Assembly debates, legislative records, official records, media sources, and I conducted over 52 interviews with key stakeholders, politicians, people who became very prominent and influential politicians in the 80s and 90s and the 2000s in these 2 countries. I'll be more than happy to talk about this in the Q&A if you are interested in more of that information. So now let's look at violence in Colombia and how it produced a regime change and political exile. By the late 1970s and the early 80s, Colombia entered a new wave of political violence. Paramilitary groups and drug cartels launched campaigns of violence that systematically eliminated emerging opposition. Paramilitaries like the Autodefensas Unidas de Córdoba and Urabá, ACCU, trained alongside state forces, while drug traffickers built on illicit empires that spread across regions in Colombia. The targets were clear. Movements such as Nuevo Liberalismo, the Unión Patriótica, and the Alianza Democrática M19, although diverse in form, this violence overwhelmingly concentrated left-wing parties and movements with fragile political capital. The result was a deep crisis of legitimacy driven by 3 forces: the rise of drugs, fragmentation of traditional parties, especially the Liberal Party was fragmented significantly during this time, and the growing consolidation of guerrilla groups. To grasp the scale of this period, let me now turn to patterns of massacres and casualties that illustrate how pervasive the violence became in Colombia. So these charts, using data from Colombia National Center for Historical Memory, show the scale of violence between 1970 and 1990. I used a big data set that they have just to get a sense of how was the broad violence in the region at the time. The top line traces the number of massacres, which rises steadily through the 1980s. The bottom line shows the number of victims with a sharp escalation by the end of the decade. Together, they capture how violence intensified, reached unprecedented levels just before 1991, right before the Constituent Assembly started. So this figure illustrates, I'm funneling from general violence to violence against political parties so that I can, present the argument. This figure illustrates the sharp escalation of violence in Colombia beginning in the late 1970s. According to the National Center for Historical Memory, 15,000 people disappeared between 1985 and 1990 alone. The blue line tracks civilian casualties, while the orange captures combatants, members of both legal and illegal armed forces. What stands out is the political violence overwhelmingly targeted civilians, especially activists and members of emerging political parties. By contrast, the violence among armed groups, shown in orange, was less intense and even plateaued in the mid-1980s. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that this was not a war between armed actors. It became a war against society. And this, I'm not the first person who claims this. There are very renowned Colombian authors who have claimed this war against society. And that shift profoundly shaped the political organization of Colombians, both at home and in exile. This graph highlights how political violence, we're funneling, in Colombia overwhelmingly targeted small oppositional parties. In other words, it was directed to left-wing organizations and dissident minorities within the traditional parties, as I already said. The red area represents the Unión Patriótica, which suffers, Patriotic Union, which suffers the most devastating losses. The green area shows the Nuevo Liberalismo, a dissident faction of the Liberal Party. You can ask any Colombian. I think one of the most tragic events in our history have been the genocide and the killing of the leaders of the Nuevo Liberalismo. Like the Unión Patriótica, Oh, the red area is, like the Unión Patriótica, Nuevo Liberalismo lost its most visible leaders, presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán Sarmiento, Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, as well as many rank and file members at the regional level. So this happened for the Unión Patriótica, but also for the Nuevo Liberalismo. This was a campaign of targeted elimination that reshaped Colombia's political landscape. This table gives us a clearer picture of who was targeted between the 80s and 90s. Between 1980 and 1990, more than 2,300 politically affiliated Colombians. So these are not random Colombians. These are political leaders that are actually labeled within the databases of the killings as politically engaged with X, Y, or Z political party. So politically affiliated Colombians were killed. Strikingly, over 70% of them belonged to the Unión Patriótica. Another 10% were members of the Liberal Party, but mainly were the dissidents of the Nuevo Liberalismo. The numbers show how violence was not evenly distributed across political spectrum. It overwhelmingly concentrated on new and oppositional movements that threatened the traditional party system. In short, this was a targeted politicide designated to eliminate the possibility of alternative political projects that were barely emerging in the country around the time. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint of what happened with the genocide of the Unión Patriótica. The political genocide against the Unión Patriótica is perhaps the clearest example of the systematic elimination of opposition in Colombia. Since 1984, Unión Patriótica members were assassinated in a campaign carried out by paramilitaries, drug traffickers, state forces, and even public officials. Now we know because of the transitional justice and all the processes that are ongoing. The toll was staggering. 2 presidential candidates, 8 congressmen, 13 national deputies, 70 council members, 11 majors, and more than 4,000 militants and supporters were killed, kidnapped, and disappeared. This was not random violence. It was a deliberate strategy to erase an emergent political alternative. This map visualizes the geography of the lethal violence against members of the Unión Patriótica between 1984 and 1990. I created the map using the data from Colombia's National Center of Historical Memory. What it shows is striking. While the Unión Patriótica was singled out as a political target, the violence was not confined to one area. It was systematic and spread across multiple regions in the country, and you'll see how it's different for Argentina for different reasons, but I'll go over it in a minute. From the Caribbean coast to the Andean interior, the attacks to Unión Patriótica members, leaders, and supporters revealed the nationwide scale of this campaign of political extermination. The genocide of the Unión Patriótica was not recognized until, I think, spring of last year by the international courts. So it seems to us as obvious, but it has not been recognized by the Colombian state. It was recognized a year or a couple of years ago in a very tedious and long process that led to the international courts. Now let's move into Alianza Democrática M19, so the ADM 19. The Unión Patriótica was not only the political force targeted. In other cases, Alianza Democrática M19, unlike the Unión Patriótica, this party originated in a guerrilla organization. After demobilizing in 1990, the M19 transformed into a political movement and played a central role in the peace process and in the Constituent Assembly. You'll see in a minute. One of its more visible leaders was Antonio Navarro, a former dean and intellectual. Navarro, pictured here in the Constitutional Assembly, here next to the leader of the guerrilla, second in command here. This is when they signed the agreement. And I think he was on one end. This is the president of Colombia. So it's a central figure in this story. So he was a former dean, an intellectual. Navarro survived an assassination attempt and spent 5 years in exile, 3.5 of which he spent in Mexico. He later became second in command of the M19 and led the peace agreement, was the co-president of the 1991 Constituent Assembly, and went on to serve as a senator until 2018, and is currently the co-president of the Green Alliance Party. So this is a longstanding, elite kind of, politician in Colombia. In the next slide, I will share part of my interview with Navarro, where he reflects on his experience of exile and political reintegration. This is the only thing I'm going to show.
Yo fui fundador de M19, no estuve en la fundación. Yo después de que ya estaba organizado ese grupo armado. Yo soy ingeniero era profesor de la Universidad del Valle, después fui decano de Ingeniería Sanitaria, estudié en Inglaterra, era digamos, un técnico, pero me llamó la atención la respuesta de M19 a lo que fue, en mi criterio, un fraude electoral el 19 de abril de 1970, cuando el general Rojas Pinilla ganó las elecciones. Pero en 1984 hubo un intento de paz.
Exactamente.
Y yo fui el que quedó encargado del M19 de encabezar esas conversaciones con el gobierno en búsqueda de una posibilidad de acuerdo de paz. Esas conversaciones se realizaron entre mediados de 1984 y mediados de 1985. Y finalmente eso terminó mal. Terminó porque, como le digo, estaba yo desayunando en una cafetería con un grupo de compañeros en la ciudad de Cali y llegó alguien y me tiró una granada que estalló al lado de mi pie y me hirió de mucha gravedad y como resultado de esa herida, finalmente primero fui hospitalizado en Cali, después me permitieron salir del país por presión de una serie de opinadores y de periodistas importantes del país que le pidieron al gobierno que me permitiera salir del país. Y entonces me ofrecieron la posibilidad de ir a varias partes y yo escogí el ofrecimiento de México. Entonces, en junio de 1985 yo salí del país, todavía con la pierna desbaratada, pero en su lugar salí hacia México. En México me hospitalizaron y me amputaron la pierna izquierda. Desde eso quedé con una pierna amputada y quedé hablando mal porque se me entraron una estirla, me entró por allí por el cuello. Me cortó un nervio, se llama el nervio hipoglóso, y ese controla la lengua. Entonces yo no puedo controlar bien la lengua al hablar. Por eso hablo como hablo ahora. En Pasto dicen Navarro habla claritico, pero no se le entiende nada. Bueno, la verdad es que me amputaron la pierna en México, entonces yo me quedé viviendo en México. Viví 3 años y medio en México. Mientras el M19 volvió al lanzamiento armado, estaba en una tregua, dio por terminada la tregua después del atentado. Y de nuevo en 1989 empezó otro intento de paz con otro gobierno, con el gobierno de Virgilio Barco. Bueno, Gabriel García Márquez le solicitó al presidente Miguel de la Madrid y al presidente de México en esa época que permitiera mi llegada a México. Y, como le digo, una carta firmada por los principales periodistas de Colombia, Yamir Amar, Juan Rosaín, Laura Restrepo, los Santos, una serie de periodistas de alto nivel, directores de medios de comunicación, le pidieron al presidente Betancourt que permitiera mi salida. Me ofrecieron 3 opciones: ir a Cuba, ir a Suiza o ir a México. En México, quien hacía la gestión era Gabriel García Márquez, que vivía en México y era un hombre muy importante desde esa época, ya premio Nobel de Literatura. Entonces, yo escogí entre las 3 opciones, escogí México. Y me pareció que México era una buena opción. Así que escogí México, me fui, me llevaron a un hospital, fue el Hospital Mosel en México. Y después de eso, entonces decidieron amputarme la pierna. Entonces, después de amputado, seguí viviendo en México. Viví en México porque el gobierno mexicano me permitió, con la condición de que no hiciera nada público en México. Se me pidieron bajo perfil. Así que viví en México de bajo perfil, pero salía de México como tenía una visa de turista en México, tenía que estar saliendo y entrando del país periódicamente. Entonces iba a Nicaragua, iba a Europa, iba a Cuba, iba a Panamá, a trabajar en cosas del M19, a hacer una diplomacia, digamos, a favor del M19. Y volví a México. Y ahí en México pues viví 3 años y medio. Pero sentía mucha nostalgia por Colombia. Quería volver a mi país. Hice un intento de volver clandestinamente y no pude, porque pues por la pierna no se podía. Y entonces cuando finalmente empezó un nuevo proceso de paz a mediados del 89 volví a Colombia.
Ujú.
Me integré al equipo negociador de paz que finalmente consiguió resultados. Se fue el acuerdo de paz del 9 de marzo de 1990. Bueno, yo no soy fundador del M19, no estuve en la fundación.
Ujú.
Yo entré después de que ya estaba organizado ese grupo armado.
Ujú.
Yo soy ingeniero, era profesor de la Universidad del Valle.
Did it start? I think it did, huh? Okay, it did, huh?
Just start.
Yeah. Okay, so let's continue. In my interview with Antonio Navarro, let's highlight the three key things that stood out to me during our conversation. First, political exclusion in Colombia. Navarro recalls the electoral fraud of April 1970, when former dictator Rojas Pinilla was denied a victory. He went to the polls and he won, and the political parties shut everything down and turned off the lights. And following day, Colombians woke up to a different president. For him, that moment of exclusion explains why a university dean ended up joining the M19 guerrilla. Second, the experience of politicide, even as he participated in peace talks, Navarro survived an assassination attempt, an example of how efforts of negotiation were met with violence. Third, his exile in Mexico, and I want to highlight this. Navarro was able to relocate thanks to his connections with prominent journalists, as he already mentioned, unlike Argentine exiles, and this is important, who became highly vocal in Mexico. I traced them down, Casa Argentina and Solidaridad, and so on and so forth. Navarro could not openly voice his political positions. Still being in Mexico provided him with a crucial platform from which he conducted diplomacy on behalf of the M19 and channeled political transformations in the homeland. But this is a very particular case. So, let me see. Oh, wow. Oh. This is missing something here. Oh, here it is. This figure illustrates how political violence in Colombia was not only evenly spread. This is just to give you like a visual form. It was concentrated on the left and center, targeting emerging movements like the Unión Patriótica, Neoliberalismo, M19, and while sparing traditional parties on the right, like Partido Liberal, Partido Conservador, and Los Paramilitares. So, like the movements that they had. So I use Colombians abroad as a proxy to determine the effects on migration. So by the 1970s and 80s, Colombia had quickly become a country of immigration. It ranked second only to Mexico in the number of laborers migrant laborers leaving the continent. That's pretty interesting case. Most Colombians went to Venezuela. Between 1970 and 1991. At the same time, migration to the United States also increased, particularly after 1965 U.S. immigration reform. By 1990, about 150,000 Colombians had migrated legally, documented. So I'm using the legal documentation, and there's problematic, I know, but I use that as a proxy. Still, these growing numbers did not translate into strong political mobilization, as you will see with Argentina. Unlike the Argentine exile communities, Colombians in the United States and Venezuela did not develop the same political engagement. This is a graph of year by year that shows yearly Colombians in the United States, even with peaks around the 1980s, and again in around 1980s and the mid 1980s. We don't see a sudden spike or like a regular trend that would suggest large-scale political exile. Even when the 1986 U.S. Immigration Reform Control Act, IRCA, was in place and did not produce mass migration. The main point is that Colombian migrants in the U.S. grew gradually, but without the dramatic surges we might expect in political violence, along with decisive factors. So now let's look at Colombia's democratic transition. Almost done with the case, and then Argentina will be easier because Argentina will know it was a dictatorship. And immigrant political actors' conversion to approval of immigrant rights. So in the 1980s, and this is where I place my analytical framework, in the 1980s, state faced guerrilla insurgencies, paramilitary violence, drug wars, extermination of immigrant parties like the Unión Patriótica, as I said, neoliberalismo. This produced the seventh ballot and the Constituent Assembly of 1991. Okay, so what was the seventh ballot and how is this important for the approval of rights? To confront ongoing violence and decades of political exclusion, students and civil society launched the initiative known as the seventh ballot, La Séptima Papeleta. The movement called for the creation of a constituent assembly to refound the political system. The initiative gained overwhelming support. They gained about 2 million votes in favor. By 1990, Colombian elected 70 representatives from across the political spectrum to draft a new constitution. This marks the beginning of one of the most ambitious political reforms of Colombia's recent history. Here you have the Constituent Assembly of 1991. You see it was a three-part presidency. The conservatives, the conservatives, M19, and the Liberal Party. In February 1991, Colombia convened a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution, a process designed as both political reform and a peace agreement among competing actors. This photo that you have here captures his three co-presidents, Antonio Navarro Wolf from M19, as you already know, Álvaro Gómez Hurtado, a dissident from the conservative leadership, and Horacio Serpa Uribe from the Liberal Party. In the elections leading up to the assembly, the newly demobilized Alianza Democrática achieved nearly 27% of the votes of this constituent assembly, the highest share ever won by an alternative political force in a national collegiate body, as Navarro Wolf himself reminded me in our interview. So how this turns into inclusion and more rights for people abroad. Inside the assembly, immigrant rights gained traction through a broad coalition, liberal survivors of Nuevo Liberalismo, M19, and diaspora organizations. For them, Colombians abroad were framed as a political minority, and this is important, as a political minority comparable to ethnic and regional groups. It's very interesting. It's within the same rights as the indigenous and as the Afro-descendants. That's Afro-descendants, Afro-Colombians. That's how they are framed in our constitution. The new constitution recognized dual nationality, extraterritorial voting, and even congressional representation abroad. These images right here come from my research in the National Archive. What you see here are the letters sent by Colombians abroad during the Constituent Assembly. For example, the Centro Cívico Colombiano sent this to Carlos Osa Escobar, which was a representative of the M19, Alianza Democrática M19, the political party. And then this one was towards Ivan Marulanda. I interviewed these individuals. And this is from a personal archive in Los Angeles. I found a leader in Los Angeles, and he gave me his personal archive before retiring. And I found this communication between the Nuevo Liberalismo and people back home in the 1980s. And I keep all of those boxes of archives because you never know what you can find later on. Okay, so I wanted to show you that. And for those who are interested in the actual archives. This proposal by the Alianza Democrática laid out the political rights for Colombians abroad. It framed immigrants as the responsibility of the Colombian state, which was tasked by defending their rights. It even proposed, and I want to highlight this because I found this interesting when I was reading the archive, that the state should facilitate their return to the homeland, as assuming that they were abroad, but they didn't want to be abroad. And this connects when I talk about this with Navarro, with Antonio Navarro Wolf, Mr. Senator Navarro Wolf. He said this feeling homesick, and that's why I brought it in the interview, and I showed it to you, that he was like homesick. He wanted to go back, and even when he was like impaired by his condition, his medical condition, he always wanted to come. So the actual proposal was including that the state will do all its effort. And initially they thought about paying for them to repatriate, come back to the homeland, but it didn't work out that way because it was a constituent assembly, so everybody had to be aligned. Colombia's reforms carry strong legitimacy, so this is the outcome. These are the three proposals I found in the archives. They were debated and ratified by an inclusive assembly, yet they were ineffective in curbing violence or ensuring justice. The state remained too weak to protect citizens at home or abroad. This is the essence of violent democratization. Rights extend through inclusion, but without pacification. And when you look fast forward in the 90s and the early 2000s in the story of Colombia, the violence became even worse, and we had even more exiles in the next 2 decades. So now the case of Argentina, which shows a different trajectory. Hopefully this will be easier because now I made a case for Colombia, and then Argentina is hopefully a little bit easier. First, let's look at how widespread violence in Argentina fueled the regime crisis and mass exile. So again, the summary of the context: Argentina's political violence took shape under the military junta of General Jorge Videla and company, as I say, while left-wing groups like Montoneros radicalized in response. Keep in mind that Montoneros are well known for being left-wing guerrillas, but they were part of the peronism del peronismo, right before the a couple of years before the actual dictatorship. So Montoneros was a young left-wing working class peronistas that actually demobilized and mobilized in arms and created the big events that many of you saw in the 1970s. So the regime relied on war consuls, clandestine detention centers, as in the German style, and systematic repression. Now we know this. In 2015, this was discovered. Even targeting members of traditional parties such as the Peronista and the Radicals. The Radicals are like the conservative party in Argentina. Don't quote me on that. This combination of dictatorship and state-sponsored violence produced a profound crisis of legitimacy. And I'm going to show you a little bit of the same thing I did with Colombia, how the numbers look. These are the clandestine detention centers this information was released in 2015, so this is recent. This graph illustrates the distribution of clandestine detention centers across Argentina based on data from the Registro Unificado de Víctimas del Terrorismo Estado RUFTE from now on. For 2015, you will notice a high concentration in Buenos Aires, and that's not surprising, and I want to highlight this intentionally. In the 1980s, Greater Buenos Aires was home to nearly 10 million people, over half of Argentina's population at the time, making it the country's most densely populated region, while Buenos Aires saw the largest number. Detention centers were across the provinces and underlying the regime's reach into many parts of the country. So this is the way the Argentine society has come to terms with this, has shown that, in fact, this was systematic, it was planned. This is recent information, but I want to highlight that unlike Colombia, where the population is spread throughout the territory, in Argentina, we see a big percentage of the population in the conurbado, in the greater Buenos Aires, as you would call it in English. So there's an effect of the number of victims in this region, but the effect on the parties is wide, as hopefully I can make a case. So this graph is based also on RUFTE 2015 and shows the victims of forced disappearances and assassinations of the dictatorship. What stands out is the sharp concentration of violence in just a few years. And then in 1976, the year of the military coup, nearly 3,800 victims were recorded, 44% of the total that were actually recorded. The following year, and keep in mind that I want to highlight recorded because these are under representations of what actually happened. The following year, another 2,800 cases, more than 3/4 of the disappearances and assassinations took place within the first 2 years of the regime. The Truth Commission later documented 12,000 civilian victims, but the spike reminds us that the regime strategy was intense, front-loaded campaign, and repression. And it was aiming to consolidate the control. So this is a breakdown of the CONADEP, the Truth Commission in Argentina. This table from CONADEP in 1984 shows the occupations of some of the reported cases. About 9,000 cases were documented in the Truth Commissions in 1994. The data suggests that repression cut across many sectors of society. But it is important to remember, and I want to highlight this, that these numbers don't capture what they don't capture. So I want to show you, we see, 15,000, this many thousand, but many of my interviewees emphasize that the figures underrepresent the true scope of repression, since middle and upper class families were more likely to denounce disappearances. And this came up in several of my interviews. And I found that I saw this argument many times. Working class Argentines, by contrast, often remain silent out of fear. This silence means that official statistics tell only part of the story. That's why they're trying to reframe it as the not just the military dictatorship, but the civil and military dictatorship of Argentina. This table is party distribution. So this is the Archivo de Parque de la Memoria, of the data from 2024, and it has the breakdown of there's a big park, for those of you who know, that has all the names of people and their actual membership, political membership. So this shows the membership of all of the victims between 76 and 1983. And at the top, you'll have many organizations who were affected, but primarily splintered groups of Peronismo. So you see different forms of Peronismo throughout, but just the same party. Reflecting the fragmentation of the movement during the dictatorship, but repression also struck at the heart of the traditional parties. Many victims were high-profile politicians, both of the Unión Cívica Radical, or the radicals, and the main Peronist factions, like Carlos Menem, who became a president and passed his rights, or Hipólito Leydy Diossa-Jimenez, who became a senator, and we can go on and on and on and on and on. And this is just an example. So it included many people from Unión Cívica Radical, Partido Justicialista, all of the Juventudes, Peronistas, something. So these are young Peronists, Montoneros. The only one that was left out is the AAA, or the Alianza Antiterrorista Argentina. So it was like the paramilitary hand of the state. It was actually in governing with right before the dictatorship of Jorge Videla. Okay, so I wanted to highlight that. It was widespread. Everyone was involved. So I am not going to show you all the interviews. I have, if you're happy, if you're willing to or want to, I'm more than happy to go over this, but I just want to show you one example. This is Federico Storani. This is like saying this is the equivalent of Mitch McConnell, keeping its proportions, like a leader, a solid traditional leader in a conservative party. This excerpt comes from my interview with Federico Storani, whom I spoke with in Argentina. Storani was an important leader in the Juventudes Radicales, so the radicals, in the 1970s, and we went on to become one of the most influential politicians in the decades that follow. For the sake of time, I won't present his interview in full here, but I want to highlight one key point. The networks of Argentines abroad were deeply connected to those still operating inside the country. Storani describes what we know as the Thursday dinners in France, a very famous events in the literature on human rights. Regular gatherings brought together exiles and militants of semi-clandestine situations, and then dinners became central spaces for exchanging information and linking exile activism with domestic resistance, part of a much larger transnational network of oppositions to the dictatorship. And he talks about how he would escape, going through the north, changing passports. He would go and have dinner with Hipólito Leydy Diossa-Jimenez, which is a pretty traditional senator, nephew of a president of Argentina. This is like the elites. This is a chart that shows Argentines abroad, the same logic that I used in Argentina. I reconstructed this. I did this by using several sources. I just want to highlight quickly how it was from 1973, because remember, they were like on and off dictatorships. So there was the Onganía dictatorship around that, and then around that time, and then here was going up, up, up. But look at this. People kept leaving after the dictatorship ended. And that is because many of the people who were exiled were actually targeted, even when they requested habeas corpuses for in the state. And I document that extensively in my dissertation. Hopefully in my book, you'll be able to read it if you're interested. This is a list of Argentines abroad and the censuses. So it was just a collection of, how many Argentines abroad, to compare the effect of the beginning of the dictatorship from this to this. So it doubled. Okay, and this is the trend. It was going up because the cara pintadas rising and all the violence that was happening around the time actually kept the violence going. And we don't talk about that very often. Now let's examine the democratic transition so that I can round this up and I can open up for hopefully a couple of minutes of Q&A. So this is the Argentine trajectory. The transition after the Malvinas defeat was marked by a deep uncertainty. Alfonsín, which is the first president after the dictatorship, tried to consolidate democracy while facing repeated military uprisings from mainly the Carapintadas, which is like a dissident faction of the army in Argentina. and economic collapse on top of that. So it was an overlap. At stake was the dual transition, delivering justice for dictatorship crimes, while avoiding a return to authoritarian rule. This tension between inclusion and pacification defined an early democratic years of the time. And this is what happened within this period. Alfonsín initially pursued truth and justice, creating the CONADEP and prosecuting the junta militar. Many of them were, served many decades, but soon retreated through the full stop and due obedience law. So he pushed back a little bit because, the army was going to take over again. So to avoid that, he stepped back a little bit, and then Menem came. There's a famous walk of Alfonsín and Menem, where Alfonsín gave him the country, saying, you need to prevent this. And there's a full documentation of this, and and Alfonsín's memories and so on and so forth, so if you're interested in that. Menem went further, issuing sweeping presidential pardons. So we are nowadays accustomed to pardons in the United States, but pardons are in the Constitution of the United States and are used, many times. In Argentina, it was in the Constitution since 1912, and Menem was the first person who used them. It's a betray of the population. So when you ask an Argentine on the streets, like this, and even though it was a constitutional right that Menem had, but it's framed as that. So sweeping presidential pardons, both for the militaries and the guerrillas. So in this context, the approval of immigrant voting rights in 1991 was passed quickly and without debate. A bundle of low-cost measures meant to restore legitimacy, not only political rights for exiles. This is I found this in the archive, and I have never seen a law pass this quickly. It was pretty from August till November. I think November 1st, it was approved like this, and it went from one chamber to the other, and it was quickly like many others. So this was, we're giving you what you want, and we're giving everyone what they want, so that we can pacify, make sure that there's no return of the dictatorship. It was actually the outcome. It was a pretty, broad framing with votes, and pretty quickly they actually applied these rights. So to conclude, quickly, I talk about political violence and politicide, and how it shapes and how it turns into the mobilization. But I want to get into this, and I want to read it because I think it's important. First, I contribute, because this is like my main contribution. I contribute a political typology of politicide, widespread versus targeted, to explain variation of exile political potential. Second, I extend democratization theory by analyzing dual transitions, showing how trade-offs between inclusion and violence controls shape rights outcomes. And third, I conceptualize exile as a potential mechanism. This is where I hope we all keep the positive take on all of this madness. So as a potential mechanism for a democratic reentry, not just a loss on political agency, but sometimes a source of it. I refrain from being pessimistic about this. I integrate comparative historical process tracing with multi-sided archival work to uncover these mechanisms. Political violence shapes not just both who live, but what exile can become. Exile can be a site of democratic persistence, political memory, mobilization, and survival. And it can reshape the homeland. I want to thank the funding agencies, of course, but I also want to thank, and this I always do it, the individuals who were part of this research. Thank you for the generosity of their time and for sharing their stories. I interview people who I show on Navarro because Navarro has a positive and kind of humor-like approach to this, but I interview many people who have gone through their difficult things. Thank you for the generosity of their time, for sharing their stories with me. It's an honor to be here and to be able to present what they have shared with me. Even when they have endured terrible experiences of violence, many of these individuals remain in exile and cannot return to their homelands. Today, my deepest gratitude. With this, I'm going to turn the floor to Dan in 3 minutes of Q&A. Wow.
Open up and just collect a few questions and just take a little time, give you a chance to breathe, hydrate. That was a tour de force. So, a few questions on the table. Ready?
one is how to measure political inclusion. The second one is whether the two dimensions of the framework mutually exclusive.
And the second was?
Are they mutually exclusive?
Mm-hmm. Exclusive. Uh-huh.
I have a question about like when these three types of what do you call it, political rights get passed in these two countries, are exactly the laws be enforced at the same degree? Because
The enforcement, the implementation, you ask.
it just reminds me of the comparison between the Mexico and the Dominica. Like the citizens both have like exterritorial voting rights. But in practice, they're quite different because
Yes.
Dominica could just mail their vote back, but for Mexico, they have to reach themselves to
Yes.
close to the border to
Yes.
vote as a party station.
Uh-huh.
So I'm thinking about like in procedures, in what kind of things are they the same or are they different?
I love this question.
And you as well. More.
Thanks for such like eye-opening talk. I have a question. I like the table that you showed of the kind of political violence and inclusion. And when I think about political violence, another related thing I think about is kind of the state. To what extent the state owning violence means of coercion, means of violence. I'm wondering specifically on kind of military, along with the due process that you show us. Could you say a little bit more about like kind of the role of military and like the military mobilization, recruitment of the population, the two cases, or maybe more general, nothing that
Mhm.
kind of decrease or not really decrease violence.
Super interesting.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. That was super interesting. I was curious whether how you thought about differences in kind of elite standing and political standing of the exiles and how that might relate to different mechanisms for contributing to democratic renewal or not. Because I was struck by both of the kind of interview excerpts you gave us were of political elites. And I was wondering whether those hundreds of thousands of other immigrants, whether they were feeding into kind of decades down the road, processes of democratic renewal in different ways. And the case that I was actually thinking this through, and I want to put this on the table, was you're talking, you think a lot about all of the political exiles after '89 Tiananmen in China. Definitely some of those exiles did become politically active abroad. And the conditions for them to be back in domestic politics are very limited, but they have been kind of a vocal source of critique of China, especially in the 90s and 2000s. But actually, in my experience, the majority of emigres from China in that period have not necessarily been very critical of the Chinese regime after they left. They have kind of engaged in other forms of influence both abroad and domestically within China. So I was curious whether what you have to say about dynamics in terms of political standing of emigres and how that.
Interesting.
You do not need to answer everything. I'm going to sneak a couple questions in too, just to be more time to breathe. So I was curious, so theoretically, why you come to the conclusion. It struck me as a little counterintuitive, this idea that, if I get it right, that where you have targeted repression, that you end up with more cohesive movements, and where you had widespread repression, you wind up with more fragmented movements in response.
Ideas?
Because if I got that right, because at least in political science, I think we tend to think the opposite. So if you think about work like Liz Nugent's work on Egypt and Tunisia, and the idea there is that if the authoritarian regime uses like kind of blanket repression, it unifies opposition because you're not dividing those who suffer from those who don't. So that's what the Tunisian case. Whereas in Egypt, because Islamists suffered very different kinds of repression than non-Islamists, they wound up mistrusting each other. So I kind of that logic wasn't justified. So I'm curious again, you don't do it today, but I'm curious why you think about it that way. And the other thing I want to be on the table is I'm curious about this constituent assemblies, just as kind of an institution. And I'm curious how many cases in Latin America were having them around this time, because it seems to me a constituent assembly is like, I don't know, it's like fishing with this enormous net. You're catching all these different things in it. It's kind of an occasion, it's a kind of event at which and writes for you and writes for you, and then another gets on the table. And you just imagine in the context of a constituent assembly that exile, that these kind of immigrant rights would get swept in. But if the institutions were different, maybe not. So I'd be kind of curious if there might be something about that institutional story could be part of what makes this actually happen as well.
The mechanism of the Constituent Assembly
Yeah.
itself. Because
So, yes, so I'd say 5 to 10 minutes if you want to take some time. Feel free to just anything on there you found interesting or want to play with.
Uh-huh.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, so the first question on political inclusion and if it is exclusive from violence. So I take the general description, like definition of like a democratization process. So it's basically including different categories, providing means, and also providing venues for different points of view. So this is not something I am I'm not reinventing the wheel here. This is like democratic transition kind of literature. I'm just putting it together with the effect of the violence dimension, which has not been linked extensively, with one exception of one scholar, Stanford, who has, slightly mentioned it, I think one time. So that's where I'm making it work. And I think in 2x2 tables, that's how I think usually. I guess I was trained like that and we think like that. And that, yes, they're mutually exclusive. The more inclusion, you're supposed to see less violence, because the more inclusion means more capacity to hear other people's points of view, and therefore, more diverse forms of incorporation, political, social, cultural, you name it. So they're mutually exclusive. I knew you were going to ask me something like that. The enforcement, pretty interesting. Argentina and Colombia approved and implemented these rights pretty quickly in 1993. So the next electoral competition happened with all of these laws in place. So they were not only approved but also enforced, unlike the Mexican case. I can go on the Mexican case, where they approved but they rarely they didn't implement, or they implement in a way, as you mentioned it, where it was so difficult to fill out the form that a Mexican in the United States would have to pay $1,200 in 2006 to vote from abroad. So it was from out of pocket. So all of these mechanisms count. So it's a good, you're pointing at the right direction of the law enforcement and how the laws are, might be approved but not substantively implemented. And both the Colombian and the Argentine case have moved historically towards opening. I have, quote me on that, until like 2019, 2020. I don't know more recently how that happened, but it was historically moving towards like the implementation. So hopefully that violence, the role of the military. Wonderful. It is a great question. It's very puzzling. Unlike the dictatorship in Argentina, where they did all the work, all the job, all the killings, all the assassinations, and so on and so forth, what we know from the military in Colombia, and I've had conversations with experts in the region and in Colombia, the military has actually passed that responsibility onto the paramilitaries, the autodefensas de Colombia, like ACCUs. So that has been given to them, to the point that the military has said, we didn't do anything. One of the most important interviews, I would say, in terms of that I did on an exile, was a person who is still abroad, and I don't know where that person is, because we did an unlocalized interview, but the person still cannot go, and he left in the 1990s, I guess. So the military did the work in Argentina, and in Colombia, what they did is they passed it on to the militaries, and they trained them, and they also, of course, have hidden behind the drug issue and war. Okay, so the elites, important. Many of these people became elites, but they were not elites. So this is a dean. So Navarro is a dean. Senator Navarro Wolf, it's a dean that became a very prominent politician. Many of these people became very important elites. Many are traditional politicians or people who inherit political capital from their grandparents and their fathers and so on and so forth, but many didn't. So that's a good point of view. I'll need to think about Argentina, because in Argentina we see pretty prominent elites. Hipólito Solari Yrigoyen is a big name that stands out, but many of the people who were part of the Montoneros also became very vocal and very central in this story. Targeted. So targeted. I think I have to rephrase it because I'm thinking exactly the same. So targeted. When I say political violence that is targeted creates cohesive exile, meaning that they are aligned in terms of the principles, in terms of what they think Colombia should be and how they think we should stabilize our democracy, as opposed to fragmented, where in the case of Argentina, many people met throughout the world trying to figure out where should we push this. Should we push Argentina back to democracy? Should we push Argentina to a communist, socialist regime? And it's not unified. Now, they were able to vocalize and become networks throughout countries, France, Mexico, Venezuela, in many instances, that became, renowned leaders on human rights and all that stuff. But in terms of agreeing as to how we should move the democracy forward, it's what I see that in the interviews more in the Argentine and the Colombian case. They are very aligned in terms of principles, very democratic principles, and so on and so forth, as opposed to the Argentinians. So that's what I found. And it is interesting because Chile did a constituent assembly, and the rights were not approved. So, but I haven't thought about the Constituent Assembly because I have all my cases mapped out. The 19 cases that you saw there, I already read about the entire region, but not the Constituent Assemblies. But I'll look and see which ones had, and if it's a mechanism as a possible explanation. Thank you, Dan. This is a story of an elephant that gave birth to a mouse. Hopefully, in the next 2 years, I am going to turn this into how exiles shape the broader democracies in Argentina and Colombia, not just in political rights for immigrants abroad. Thank you so much for being here.